only.
10, 9, ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
Up only.
Hello and welcome to Up Only TV. I'm Ledger. Cobie's on the line, and we have really smart people with us today. We are thankful for them joining us. It's Peter Van Valkenburgh from Coin Center and Rebecca Rettig from Aave. Let's just get straight to the show. Oh, Cobie, what did I do? There we go. Oh God, it wouldn't be Up Only if I didn't do that. And I've got you muted. There you go. Hey, how's it going?
Well done, mate. You're getting there.
Yeah,
it's only been 2 years. Practice.
You know, whatever.
We made it. All right. The most important question, Peter. Do you own a pudgy penguin?
No, but Niraj has one. He's even got the rod.
Yeah, you gotta have a ROG. Come on, man.
Rog. I'm sorry. I don't know the memes.
Yeah.
You should have had
It's
him
like
on.
a GIF or a GIF kind of thing.
Do you prefer pudgy penguins or sappy seals, Rebecca?
The pudgies.
Yeah. All right. Cool. Glad we got that out of the way. So yeah, I guess we organized this about a week ago, maybe 2 weeks ago. I don't remember, when stuff was blowing up, and I was like, can we just chat about what are the implications of the FTX saga on the crypto industry? I guess was the big question that will kind of focus our energy on for the next however long. But then a bunch of stuff's happened since. So like Sam's now on a PR tour, it seems like some kind of, I don't really know. Rebecca, what do you think he's doing?
Thankfully, I can't really see too deeply into his mind, but I do think it's a bit of a redemption tour, and trying to create a narrative that's different than what the facts appear to be as we've seen them unravel publicly to date.
Yeah, I spoke to a family member that like follows crypto but doesn't have any money in crypto, and I asked them what they knew of the FTX situation. It was like, oh, is that where the bank run happened? And I was like, okay, normal people who just read the news think a bank run happened. I was like, yes, that's where that's where the bank run happened. Yeah.
Given that, it seems like so far he's been relatively successful in this this shift of the narrative, right? Like, because I've also had that same outcome where I talk to normal people and like, have you gotten caught up in this drama of bank run or collapse? Like, the word fraud is not coming out very frequently. So is he successful so far?
Maybe the media's helping a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, though, the question is like, will that matter in the long run, right? We've heard or know that there are investigations going on around the world, and we know that, they file for bankruptcy. So public perception is one thing, but ultimately what happens may be very different than how that's going down. I don't know.
I mean, the only thing I would say is, just because I happened to see that Matt Levine's latest column came out on Bloomberg like about an hour ago, and I read it. His take is good. His take is like, here's my summary of what SBF is saying. And it's a lot of things like, oh, well, there's just margin, there's just leverage, and then there was a run on the bank. And Matt Levine puts it in quotes. And then Matt says, well, what do we care, actually, what SBF says at this point? What we should care about is what the current CEO, former Enron guy, cleaning up after Enron, is finding when he digs through the books. And yeah, I mean, I don't know any inside information that's not published in the press, but it sure looks like fraud to me. And that's all going to come out. I mean, it doesn't matter how good your crisis PR communications team is. This is going to come out, right?
Yeah, it seems like it's good, like fun voyeurism to watch. Like, he tweeted what happened over the course of 3 days, letter by letter. So it's like this sort of like car crash type entertainment, and you can't look away from it type thing happening. I think the only people that really need to care about what he says in these interviews is like the other Sam and Caroline, because he's like sort of like subtly throwing them under the bus, or not so subtly, in all these interviews, I think. But yeah, what a strange follow-up to a horrible situation.
Truly.
Yeah.
So what are we going to talk about today, Cobie?
Yeah, so we arranged this because I wanted to. I messaged Rebecca and I was like, what does this mean for the industry? Do you want to come talk about it on Up Only? And like, do the people in power in like various countries, do they understand what happened? Do they understand that this is like effectively a fraud happening at a like crypto bank rather than like a Bitcoin or Ethereum problem? Like, is that clear to these people? And will that even matter? So I'd love to chat about that stuff. I think it's quite a big question to begin with. So maybe we can just go like, for you guys are both like on the ground a little bit more than we are, because we just sit in our rooms and do a silly podcast. So like, what is the sentiment, with people on the ground in DC or wherever else?
Well, I'll take outside the US first, because I have a lot of exposure to policymakers and regulators outside the US, including very recently. And I will say, contrary to what we were just talking about with respect to the press, they all see this for the most part as a fraud, and have publicly sort of come out. Just in the EU held a big sort of public hearing earlier this week, and John Cunliffe from the BOE gave a speech maybe 10 days ago and sort of noted that it was a fraud. And I think it's very clear in other even Asian jurisdictions, which have had pretty strict crypto regulation on centralized exchanges and centralized actors, they understand it's a fraud. So certainly outside the United States, I think people understand at least what, as Peter said, is perceived to be the case. Again, no inside information on my end, and obviously only speaking for myself and nobody else. So I think that's going on there, and people are at least proceeding sort of regular course of business, regulating centralized exchanges. In the UK, they're actually starting a sandbox, including for things like DeFi. There's a plan on what to do with DeFi under MiCA, which is the Markets and Crypto Asset Regulation that's in the EU. So everyone's sort of proceeding apace outside the US, and I'll turn it over to Peter to speak a little bit more deeply on what's going on the ground in DC.
I mean, the reputational fallout in DC is going to be very real, no matter what, because it's always a struggle to get folks who are very busy and have real policy agendas in other areas to look into crypto and not just immediately jump to what is often a first perception that these things are just for criminals and for scammers, right? And we've done, this is Coin Center's objective since 2014, is to tell a balanced story. We don't sweep the fraud under the rug. In fact, we have a backgrounder that we published back then on why are there so many scams in crypto. But policymakers need to know the other side of the story, that there is real technological innovation. There's something fundamentally new here where you can have certain trusted interactions with other people online without having an intermediary. And yes, the use cases for that, the real use cases, are still fairly small and niche. Like if you want to make a donation to support the war effort in Ukraine, defense against Russia's invasion, it's actually one of the better tools than anything else out there, especially when the government of Ukraine posted an address where you could send support. For other things, though, for like a guy just at a convenience store who wants to buy a cup of coffee, crypto is terrible. And even for some of the, much vaunted Web3 use cases, like we're going to rebuild social networks or, massive platforms like Google Search or Amazon Web Services on top of blockchains, that sounds good. I believe that this is a good technology to build those things, but we've yet to see them be built in a way that are user-friendly enough and scalable enough to actually support those kinds of new systems in a large way that would meaningfully change the underpinnings of the web and make them more neutral, decentralized, censorship resistant. But the technology's on the right track, and I don't ever mean to poo-poo it too much. So my point is, when you go into a congressional office and you say, yes, you've seen ransomware attacks because maybe you had a person in your district who couldn't buy gas when the Colonial Pipeline hack happened. Yes, you've seen scams, And we still talked about Mount Gox not too long ago. And now they're going to say, and there's this massive $8 billion potentially theft or fraud. It's harder to switch the conversation to, but there is a core to this technology. Not necessarily the businesses built on this technology, some of which are not well run, but there's a core to this technology that's going to improve people's lives on balance and significantly. And that requires an element of faith in technological innovation. So it requires being able to persuasively tell a story. And when on the other side is someone saying, there was already not too many legitimate use cases for crypto, and it seems mostly like a big casino run by some kingpin who's now hiding in the Bahamas, it doesn't make our job easier. I don't mean to be doom and gloom. We're not going away. Coin Center is going to keep doing our work. And we have some inspiring stories to tell, like the ability to donate to support the war in Ukraine, and we'll keep telling stories like that. But the fallout is going to be real in that sense. Now, to more directly answer the question that you asked and the way Rebecca asked it, do policymakers know the difference? The ones that matter in DC still do. Our greatest champions on the Hill, whether it's Representative Tom Emmer or McHenry or Senator Stabenow, or the people who are working on these issues, they do know the difference. And several of them are actually working on legislation that would fill a gap in the US that's been very real, where we, for some very odd path-dependent reasons, regulate custodial intermediaries as money transmitters in the state, in each state where they have customers. And this is how, for example, Coinbase is regulated. They have to go get licensed in all the states. Actually don't know. Maybe Rebecca, you know whether FTX had licenses. I
FTX US.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
They did.
Did they have licenses in every state?
I don't know.
And maybe that it's not an easy system to comply with, and it's no excuse then for non-compliance. But it's just an irrational system. There should be a single federal regulator, which is sort of similar to what's going on in Europe with MiCA and other things. And one of the pieces of legislation that was actually moving in Congress and might still be moving was the DCCPA, the Digital Commodities Consumer Protection Act, which would have created a registration entity run by the CFTC for centralized exchanges that would require things like segregation of customer funds into qualified custodial entities, and sort of a division between exchanges and broker-dealer type activities that's supposed to be safeguards in place for the very malfeasance that appears to have happened in the FTX situation. And I don't know now if that piece of legislation, which was still just in the drafting phase, is more likely to move forward or less likely. It's sort of there's still chaos on the ground given in the wake of FTX. And I also don't know whether it changes. And the only direction I think it changes is to become a bit more hard on this stuff, because that's the only way you're going to be able to sell it to other folks in Congress, is in the wake of a crisis. We've got to be really, so it may not change. It may stay the same. It may become somewhat more punitive or more onerous from a compliance standpoint. But so realistically, that's probably the biggest change. It also may not pass. Legislation is very difficult to get through Congress.
Yeah, and just to pick up on a few things that Peter said, right? We're hearing voters who were either anti-regulation or regulation in a different way now stepping in to talk about regulation. We've seen yesterday, Senator Brown called upon the Treasury Department and Secretary Yellen to think about comprehensive crypto regulation through the Treasury Department. So sort of saying, let's not worry about the SEC and the CFTC. Like, let's come up with something that makes a lot of sense. And one of the things I'll say that I've been thinking a lot about in the wake of FTX is, like, in the US, we've gotten so caught up with are the tokens these securities or commodities that we sort of have left, as Peter said, the regulation of US exchanges to the state level on a state-by-state basis with money transmission licenses and the BIT license in New York and things like that. And so given the sort of public struggle that I think some of the what I'll call regulated exchanges in the US have had, like Coinbase, Gemini, and others, I don't know if it distinguished them so much from a Bahamian regulated exchange like FTX. And so people may not have been distinguishing enough. And when we talk about a place like Japan that has very significant regulation for a centralized crypto exchange, I don't know if they're caught up in what are these tokens? We're just caught up in, like, what's the best way for an exchange of any sort that takes customer assets to be run. And I think and hope that that's sort of the first question that we're asking ourselves on a regulatory level is, less about what are these tokens and more about what is best for consumers. I'll say the other thing, just because it's sort of how we started this discussion when we were messaging, is it was an existential moment, at least for me, and I don't know about for Peter, just having been in this space for so long and really trying to see it move forward in a mature way that makes a lot of sense, and being so involved with software developers, even when I was outside counsel and now here at Aave, I really had to take a step back and say, what am I here for? And I actually read, Peter will like this, I read the Bitcoin white paper about a week after the collapse of FTX. And I said, this is what we're here for. We're here for this paradigm changing kind of technology. And yes, it hasn't gotten as far as I think we've all wanted it to, because there's been a lot of focus on number go up and sort of centralized exchanges and centralized actors in this space. But what I can say, and this goes to something Peter talked about, decentralized social media, not to shill anything, but we did build a decentralized social media protocol. It is in beta, but it's been out for, 7 or 8 months, and it has well over 100,000 profiles that have been minted there. And the biggest difference is that you never give over your data to any centralized party ever. And when you talk about that with policymakers and regulators, that really perks them up a lot, more so than DeFi or anything else. They're like, oh, that is the thing we care about a lot, that you never have to give over your data.
Especially now that everyone who's not talking about SBF is talking about Elon being forced to buy Twitter, which is an amazing turn of events. Yeah. I think, Rebecca, we should send you, we have a free gift for some of our donors. You can choose. It's the Satoshi white paper as a little pocket constitution.
Yes, I think I have that from Coin Center dinner last year.
I hope that's the one you read, because I
donated Coin Center and I never got one of them.
Yeah, you didn't dox your address.
That would have been the right way to donate.
Peter off this?
For certain reasons.
I gotta climb around, see if I can find mine.
It's cliche and it almost makes us sound kind of like a cult. Hashtag not a cult. But there is need to go back and find sort of ground truth in this environment. One thing that was disheartening to me, because I don't enjoy the circus. I don't know if anybody enjoys the circus. It seems like some people enjoy the circus a little bit, but at Coin Center, I'm the least likely to enjoy the circus. Niraj kind of seems to surf the wave on fight all of crypto Twitter, and he always looks beleaguered, but I think he actually gets a lot of energy from it. But personally, I'm struggling in my job because we're fighting this fight with respect to the Tornado Cash OFAC sanctions designation, and they undesignated and redesignated Tornado Cash. I think it was 4 days after one of the big SBF bombshells dropped, and it was just another thing that happened that week, and that made me a little sad, because I was like, this is what's actually really important. This is fundamentally different in that you've got government coming after a protocol and actually saying every US person is no longer allowed to use the software as it exists in these Ethereum addresses. So you've got a very real threat and a genuine one. They have their reasons, and they're quasi-legitimate reasons. I think they're mistaken in the way they're enforcing sanctions law, but I would never deny that sanctions aren't important and that the stuff on the line here is really significant when it comes to, say, funding of North Korean weapons programs and things like that. So we're mounting up for a really serious fight to try and preserve Americans' ability to use smart contracts that are immutable and that no one controls under conditions where no one even benefits as far as a sanctioned entity. And yet that's sort of an afterthought in the news cycle, because the SBF stuff is just so, people's just eyes are glued to every lurid detail. I want to know more about what's going on in this apartment in the Bahamas. It's gross.
Not to mention that the developer of Tornado Cash is being contained or in jail without charges.
Alexei has been held in a Dutch jail now for it's got to be 115 or 20 days. I was actually really upset to learn, given my last name is Van Valkenburgh, so I have some cultural distant, they emigrated to America in the 1600s, distant cultural allegiances to the Netherlands. But I was shocked to learn that you can hold someone without charges in the Netherlands for 110 days. And then he had a hearing recently, and they still haven't charged him, to my knowledge. They just convinced a judge that
90 days.
They can hold him for even longer. In America, we have all kinds of issues with our criminal justice system. I'm not defending the American criminal justice system, but at the very least, you have to be charged within a very short amount of time from being apprehended. And then your lawyers can start working on a defense, Well, that's the important thing.
Didn't they also start auctioning his stuff?
Ooh, I don't know.
It wouldn't surprise me. I mean, civil asset forfeiture or asset forfeiture is a big part of the criminal justice system. So I don't know that, though. I do not know.
Mark Karpelès was on the show Tuesday, and back when Mt. Gox collapsed, he had talked about how he was never charged in Japan, but he didn't call it jail, but it was like isolation in a thing that sounds a lot like jail for like 4 months in Japan. And so kind of a similar situation, and then they ended up not charging him with anything. So we do, Cobie, you're not American, but those of us who are American do have some privileges that are ones I'm thankful for. And it's been disappointing to see all this go on. If we could back up just a tad, Peter, you're talking about being upset about your role in your job in this industry, given all that's happening. I
probably overstated it just then.
Well, I bring it up.
I'm not leaving. Don't worry.
Have you ever actually? You've testified in front of Congress before. Rebecca, I can't remember if you have as well.
Not yet. Waiting for the DeFi hearing.
Okay. So, but like Peter, were you ever doing that with Sam? But no. In general, like you're now just going up there, if you forget all these freaking clowns over here, let me tell you about the real stuff, like, is that part of what's depressing about this? Is it makes it harder to be an adult in those conversations, or like feel like you're being taken as one?
It's always been a struggle in that sense. I mean, we all realized collectively in the Coin Center office that we're going to have to explain all of this to our relatives on Thanksgiving. Yeah. And we're like, oh, that's going to be an interesting one.
Yeah.
It's still, I'm whining, and I shouldn't be whining, because I have absolutely the most interesting and enjoyable job that I think any young lawyer out of law school could hope to have. And I love my team. Like, we're a 5-person team that's been together since 2014, and we're like a family. So yeah, I shouldn't be kvetching so much, but it's embarrassing sometimes when there's these ridiculous cancerous growths on top of an otherwise very nice, interesting technology.
So I'll say 2 things on that. I was down for Hill meetings, I think 10 days after the sort of bombshell dropped on everything with FTX. And I was so just walking in feeling so embarrassed. But on the flip side, in terms of what Peter was saying, what you were asking about, I do think people on the Hill can distinguish between people who are acting like adults and do have both, industry interests, but also understand the law, right? Like a lot of what, and I think Peter and Coin Center does this too, but like a lot of what I work on policy-wise is like, let me explain the technology to you so you understand how it works, and why the regulation you may be proposing isn't going to do what you think it's going to do. So I do try to be sort of patient in explaining the technology, and also bridging the gap between developers and policymakers and lawmakers. And I actually think the Hill meetings went much better than expected. I mean, there was a lot of, I think, consternation, especially that close in time, and given how close Sam had been and how much he'd been on the Hill, and in DC generally. So there was expected consternation, but people can distinguish. And I think, while there was some backlash in terms of like, we need to regulate and fast and more stringently than we thought, as Peter was alluding to, I do think people understand that this is a real industry. It's not going away. And so we have to do the right thing in any number of ways, especially with respect to retail, consumer protection, and the like.
When people say the Hill, I'm always wondering, I don't know anything about American geography. Is it actually all the like regulated buildings just on top of a hill?
Yeah, Capitol Hill.
So it's just a massive hill.
No.
When people call it the Hill, I just remember being in like primary school and there was a hill in the field, and everyone was like, "I'm going to play on the hill."
Wait,
but that's
Cobie,
very different
for
you.
What
do you mean? In the
what
UK.
country are you in? You're in the UK. All right.
Yeah.
So like this is St. Paul's. It's a beautiful cathedral, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we've got an even bigger dome because we're America. We got to be bigger. It's the Capitol building. It's where the legislature sits, and it's on a nice hill. And all the House offices and Senate offices are there.
Listen, it's a small hill, Cobie. Like, this is not a big hill.
Is this what the TV show The Hills is about?
I don't
No.
think so. Uh-oh. Oh, no.
Like an MTV show like 10 years ago or something. I don't know what The Hills is about, actually.
I don't know.
You've got the worst guess possible in me to describe pop culture references. Let's make the whole show about this.
Ledger's struggling with something. Explain your concern, Ledger. What have you done wrong?
Well, temporarily everything froze and then it came back, so it's fine.
All right, we're good. We're good. I did want to talk a little bit about what you mentioned. Like Sam was on the Hill a lot, in DC a lot or wherever. And just imagine Sam on the Hill. He was,
or the Hills, whatever that show was.
No, Sam was not on the Hills.
I mean, look, give it a few years. He might be.
Was that some MTV show with like really young kids or something?
I don't know.
I think it was.
I don't even want to think about an SBF reality show. That's just that's terrifying.
I think we're gonna have plenty of SBF related content, unfortunately.
Yeah. But he was, cozying up to regulators. I remember seeing photos of him and the CFTC team, together on Twitter. He had there was something about how many meetings he'd had with someone that came out recently. He donated a lot to politicians, apparently on both sides, both Dems and Republicans, but publicly to Democrats and in secret to Republicans or something. So he'd done a lot of cozying up to people in power in America and maybe worldwide. I don't know. I haven't followed that, if so. But does that make things much worse? Because it makes it sort of like there's a level of boldness to go into Congress or wherever and say the financial crisis happened because of these things. Crypto and FTX is transparent. That can never happen at FTX. And then 6 months later, it happens at FTX. And all these people have money donated from FTX. Is that customer deposits? And now their jobs are in question because they were so close to this guy who was doing fraud? Or is it just he's a fraudster, no one could know, we move on?
I mean, just in general, it's not surprising to me that somebody who's running a large and heavily used business in the crypto space to come to DC and take meetings with either potential future regulators, to the extent we're talking about a new, say, CFTC run licensing regime, or potential existing regulators, to the extent that some of the things trading on these platforms may or may not be securities. And so you're going to want to at least have a conversation with commissioners or the chairman at the SEC. That's all very normal. It's very normal for industries. It's less normal for the crypto industry to make substantial donations. And I think to some extent, FTX is the degree of SBF's donations was sort of a change for crypto, not for, it's very normal for big business to make donations in DC. But I think at the end of the day, what you said is people recognize that a fraudster is a fraudster. As long as you weren't complicit and you didn't know or intend to further their actions, you're not culpable. It may change the narrative in the same way that I was talking about earlier, where if you were going there and saying, oh, look at the beautiful blockchain, you can see all the transactions on it, this is how we're going to prevent the next financial crisis, and then your failure to keep records, which it appears there was a pretty deep failure to keep records, just based on public information that's now being revealed, is going to make that claim really spurious to somebody who maybe doesn't have the ability to learn enough about the technology to know that that core claim is correct when you're talking about the blockchain, but is not correct if you're talking about some centralized business that is just helping people onboard or offboard or do margin trading on a centralized basis or something like that. So, this just goes to what I was saying. I think the biggest fallout is reputational for the whole space, but it's not something that we can't recover from. And as Rebecca said, you felt energized at some level by the end of the day taking meetings. And I feel that sometimes too, because there is a story to be told here where, you know, DeFi by and large did not blow up despite several precipitous drops in the value of the relevant assets that are wrapped up in smart contracts. And most of that is due to the fact that smart contracts tend to be heavily collateralized because lending is difficult in an environment that is low trust by design, is verify, not trust. And to the extent there is some amount of leverage, it's transparent and people can see rapidly when things start to shift. And that's not the case, quite evidently, at a centralized institution. So you can paint a much sharper picture now, but you're going to have to make it into the office and get somebody to listen to you in an environment where the whole space has a damaged reputation.
Yeah, to Stani's credit, 2 years ago when we were in discussions about me coming on board to be in-house, he was like, also, we have to start doing the policy work on the DeFi side of things. And that's something I want you to take on. So when I came on, we started interviewing lobbyists around the world. And I was talking to GCs and other people at, DeFi software developers. And I was like, you guys need to get on this too. And everyone said, oh, I don't know if it's a priority right now. It's not where we want to put our focus. But I will say the efforts have obviously been important to have taken on. And we have spent, originally the plan was to do a lot of education. So to Peter's point, we actually do a lot of demos to all sorts of different agencies, to Congress people, obviously globally we do it as well, just so people can see like what it looks like, how it works, the over collateralization point Peter is talking about, which I would say is used as a proxy for creditworthiness. And what's actually been very interesting is for something like when we saw Celsius repaid all of its borrowed transactions to the Aave protocol before it ever, went into bankruptcy or something like that. Like these types of proxies for things we see in the traditional financial world seem to work in the way people anticipated them. Now, I don't think we should all be cocky and be like, DeFi stood up and nothing's wrong, right? Like to the point you said, Peter, right? Use case, and we have to be real about hacks and scams and things like that. So I don't think we should be too cocky. I do think we are still in an evolving environment. And I think especially, Web3, social media, things like that are on one side of things because it's slightly different and the stakes are different. But in DeFi, I think we have to be really serious about where the risks are and stuff like and along those lines, and be honest about where there may be places that can be better. And I will say the most interesting thing about sort of the new evolution of DeFi protocols, whether it's a new version of an existing protocol or a totally new type of, a similar type of protocol, is that the risk mitigation mechanisms are getting much more fine-tuned, right? I think a lot of the original V1, V2 of certain types of either AMMs, liquidity protocols, like Aave or Compound, things like that, were basic is not the right word, but, we're just sort of like, how do we fix, let's say level 0 and what's going on in our financial system. But now there's fine tuning on risk management. You can see it on V3 of Uniswap. You can actually see it on V3 of Aave, where there are like debt ceilings and real-time risk parameter changes being able to be made and stuff like that. And so I do think that's some of the most interesting things that are happening in DeFi. And so when you have to go talk about use cases, you have to be honest, like we haven't fixed it all today, but we're working towards it. And so you don't want to do something from a, regulatory or policy perspective to shut that down in its infancy, because let's say Maker is the oldest of the DeFi protocols. And that's what, like 6-7 years old. It's not that old in the scheme of, how things have worked, especially when you compare it to the traditional financial system or the legacy financial system. I actually prefer the legacy financial system as a term, but which has been around for hundreds of years. So I do think we have to be realistic about that as well. But on the DeFi side of things, and when you talk about it, regulators like to say same risk, same regulation when you're talking about building out regulations. And what I do think is an important point when you're talking about DeFi protocols is different risks, same regulatory outcome, right? You can't say that, you can't achieve market integrity and financial stability and consumer protection and, combating illicit finance. Those things can all be done. They just can't be done in the exact same way that you do them in the traditional financial system, right? Putting KYC on an informational only front end, does that make sense? Because KYC usually, at least in the United States, runs to financial institutions that are regulated mostly under the BSA and certainly under the umbrella of the Treasury Department if you're a money transmitter, and or an MSB being regulated by FinCEN, or otherwise being regulated as a financial institution. And an information providing front end, is that really the place where we need to do KYC? And look, I think we have to be honest about some of the conversations and take the time and be really patient in explaining how the technology works, because not all front ends are created the same. There are some that route orders and take fees and look a lot more like traditional brokers, and there are some that are not. And so, I think the most important thing people can be doing policy-wise right now is explaining how the tech works, not the centralized stuff. That for me at least looks very reminiscent of the legacy financial system. And as I said earlier, I don't think it really matters that much if they're securities or commodities. It's probably a very controversial opinion, but like, we can put some consumer protection stuff in place, right? I mean, that just seems reasonable for now.
One of the most elegant things about Bitcoin is that adversarial market participants can all operate in a way that the system still operates. You don't have to say like, please and thank you for who can participate and how. And seeing DeFi be able to start to evolve into some of those same principles where adversaries can operate and you're not like begging them to not do something. Like the system is just designed so that those adversaries can participate. It seems like it increases the health dramatically. I mean, we've recently seen an attack where someone was trying to take advantage of Curve and Aave and the leverage systems involved and try to create a problem, and that generally seemed like DeFi, like the Aave system, Curve systems kind of survived it and made out okay, despite kind of adversarial behavior. And you want to see that kind of hardening of systems be able to continue to improve, so that you're not like asking, please do this the way that we hoped it would be used, not just any way it can be used or abused.
Yeah, I think the amazing thing, even just thinking about that a little bit, is that it also even if there was an adversarial transaction in some way, shape, or form, the community and it happened in a decentralized way, right? Like all the liquidations happened in a decentralized way. The risk parameters were changed through governance afterwards, things like that. And that is really different than what we see in the legacy financial system today. To Peter's point, does it mean that now DeFi should be or can even be ubiquitous because it's a better system completely? No, but I do think not necessarily, and let's say not today, but I do think, and what I find so interesting when you hear the Bank of England speak is they do say, well, there's something here. The UK has been, notwithstanding some of the sort of historical hostility from the Financial Conduct Authority, the regulators and policymakers in the UK definitely see at least some aspect of promise here, including with things like Peter started the discussion about, with transfers of money and more efficiencies in the system that may not exist in our legacy financial system.
Is that because Rishi's got big bags?
He just came on. This has been going on for at least the last 2 years, I'd say.
But he was treasurer, he was chancellor of the Exchequer or whatever.
Yeah.
No, so what's going on here is something that we've struggled with for a long time, because we primarily focus on U.S. policy. We've occasionally reached out as Coin Center, and we've filed comments with the FCA, with the Financial Conduct Authority in the UK, when they were talking about sort of a little bit of an overbearing or too aggressive anti-money laundering KYC regime and identifying individual users. But the thing that's great about the UK, even though sometimes they overreach with surveillance, is you've got one regulator for the financial system. And that means you only have one person to talk to. A lot of what we end up with as far as problems here in the US, Rebecca was alluding to the securities versus commodities divide and how it really shouldn't matter too much from an investor protection standpoint, but it does. And we spend a long time arguing about these things. It's because we've got too much decentralization in the way the US government regulates financial products. You've got no fewer than 7 federal agencies that are all fully independent and all have their own, political appointees who have to get results for their boss, the president. Huge staffs, some of which are very well informed, extremely well informed about crypto, but don't always get listened to. And then you've also got all of the states. So every state has its own financial regulators, and some of them are very activist, like the New York Department of Financial Services with its BIT license and its trust charters. And they still want to be the cop on the block for the globe because they think all finance still goes through Manhattan. And a lot of it still does. And then you've got states that take a more apathetic approach or simply don't have the fiscal resources to actually do much in the way of policing. And so people in those states, do they just get less protection? That's kind of odd, kind of oddly and very specifically American. And the result is when you come to look at a new technology that has to fit into this already highly decentralized system is every month, basically, you get a new pronouncement from a regulator that crypto will be regulated in this form or that form. And they don't always work together to sort of coordinate that response. And so that's why, in a nutshell, I'd say the UK has been, for other reasons, the UK is good, but at the very least, they don't have the systemic problem that we have in the US, where you've got simply too many people who need to be in the same room agreeing on the same things, who have their own incentives.
I couldn't quite tell if you're talking about our financial system or our healthcare system there.
Yeah, it's probably the same problems. I'm not an expert in healthcare policy, but I've talked to one and I'm like, wow, your job's worse than mine. That's interesting.
When just before the FTX blow up happened, there was this like sort of ongoing panic on Twitter that SBF was trying to kill DeFi by like pushing some changes to some bill that is not like in final draft yet. That was like really bad for DeFi. And then he had that embarrassing podcast episode with Eric on Bankless, where he, got pretty demolished, I think, at least from audience perspective. I don't know how people on the Hill would have thought watching the debate. But does that bill still exist? Is it as bad as people were saying it was? Like, what is the general state of the coming regulations for DeFi and crypto generally prior to this blow up and prior to this reputational damage?
The specific bill in question here is what I mentioned earlier, the Digital Commodity Consumer Protection Act, or DCCPA. You can add that to your list of favorite words, including the Hill, Cobie. And
I want to hear you say Hill on like every episode from now on.
Yeah, we're going to
keep thinking
the podcast. The podcast is now called The Hill. Welcome to the Hill.
I keep thinking of the Mike Myers thing, Lothar of the Hill People, and it's an old SNL thing, and now the theme song stuck in my head. Anyway, the DCCPA is this piece of legislation that I mentioned earlier that would create a registration requirement run by the CFTC for digital currency trading facilities or digital commodity trading facilities, broker-dealers, custodians, basically the custodial and centralized intermediaries in the world. And the concern over that legislation's impact on DeFi was whether the categories, like what is a digital commodity trading facility, what is a digital commodity broker or dealer, were drafted since they were broad enough that maybe they could be applied or misapplied when the regulator goes to enforce the will of Congress, with the flexibility inherent in the way the words were drafted on the page. Misapplied to cover something like a Uniswap or an Aave, some sort of decentralized protocol that is not at all what we consider a traditional trading facility or a traditional broker-dealer. And some of the, what I'll say,
yeah, go ahead.
I'll be quick just to round it out. Those concerns are legitimate. In fact, like most of my job is waiting for Congress to draft laws and then becoming upset about how there's sort of too much looseness in the language and it should be tightened up so that we don't have these unintended consequences. But I think the sort of, this is an apocalypse for DeFi may have been somewhat overblown in the sense that we never even got final bill text. And from my sense, the drafters were very interested in working with anybody who was sort of credible in the community and wanted to suggest changes, work to modify the statutory language, to make it tighter, to avoid unintended consequences. And where we last left it, and this is still an active bill in the Senate, so this could become law still. Where we last left it, there was a a draft that was public that had a carve out for software or for validators, for miners and stakers. And that was already, I think, a pretty good carve out, because you wouldn't want a miner to be considered someone because they order transactions in a block or something like that, a trading facility, and have to register. That defeats the heart of the network, the censorship resistance and the base layer neutrality ideas that we fight for. And so that was already progress, and that language was there. The missing carve-outs, to my mind, were to do, and we wrote a blog post at the time, software developers. If all you're doing is developing software, you're not doing other things, you shouldn't be treated as a trading facility. And there's a pending SEC rulemaking to redefine exchange in the context of securities exchange regulation that could actually embrace software developers. So this is a problem at both the SEC potentially and could have been in this bill. There's a leaked version of this bill, which the authenticity of which I cannot vouch for, but it was widely discussed and leaked on Twitter, that did actually include an exemption for software developers. And so to the extent that was a bona fide working draft, and to the extent, Gabe did leak that. That was encouraging as well. And then the last problem, which I would want to see it,
like Gabriel with the sword, and the no shirt.
I think
that is different.
No, not
Gabriel
that
Hayes.
Gabriel. Not that Gabriel. No.
The one who just raised $10,000 to go eat meals in the Bahamas.
Yeah.
No.
Not that Gabriel. Okay.
No,
that
not
guy's
that Gabriel.
amazing.
Yeah.
That guy's a trip. Anyway, the last thing I'll say, I know this is sort of dry policy discussion, but the last thing that's in that bill that I would want to see adjusted before we would potentially, be okay with its passage, is the dealer definition. The broker dealer definition could potentially sweep up persons who are just buying and selling their own crypto. And what we think would be a sensible way to prevent that, which is actually the way it is in existing commodities derivatives regulation, is to have a de minimis threshold, so that below a certain amount, you're not subject to a registration requirement as a broker or a dealer. And it would be a very high de minimis amount. In the commodities space, it's on the order of millions of dollars. So we're not talking about like just $100 you're allowed to trade. You're allowed to trade a lot on your own behalf before you start rising to the level of a supervised and regulated entity. There might be another. Go ahead.
Isn't there one of the risks though of like this bill is kind of half-assed and wrong or damaging in this way over here, and then it's like, okay, it's tabled. And then, somebody that's like 99 years old, like Richard Shelby, puts it into tanks for Ukraine bill as like a throwaway item, and it gets passed in the 11th hour as my God, now this is a disaster.
That is how a lot of legislation happens, and that's how we ended up with the 6050I reporting requirements in the infrastructure bill, which we're also suing the government over, Coin Center is, and co-plaintiffs. This would be kind of radical for that, though, because it's a whole regulatory apparatus, whereas that was simply a change to a reporting requirement.
There was a talk, though, about appending the DCCPA to an Omni because of the timing, and pre everything with FTX, the timing was thought to be to get it all out and to get it passed before 2023. It would be attached to an Omni. So you're right. I mean, that's something that could have happened. I will say, just to echo a few things that Peter was talking about, the breadth of a lot of the definitions would have captured different parts and actors in the DeFi space, maybe intentionally, unclear, if not. So the dealer definition would have definitely captured LPs on Uniswap, right? So if you were providing liquidity, you likely would be considered a dealer under the definition. Same with the definition of broker, could have captured front ends of some kind, depending on what they were doing and the like. But the one thing I will say, and there was obviously a lot of backlash on Twitter saying, we don't know what this bill says and this is unfair and things like that. But the process was very open for people who asked to go in and be heard. And the DCCPA at the time was co-sponsored by Senator Stabenow and Senator Bozeman. They talked about it today at the hearing a little bit. Their staff would talk to, I don't mean like anyone off the street, but they would talk to anyone who was in the industry. And they really, I will say, were very open to understanding, and I can't speak to the centralized side of things, but understanding how this would impact DeFi and trying to figure out what could be done to both put together a bill that would pass, a bill that would make sense, and a bill that would address the differences in the technology. Obviously, we won't see what may have been in different circumstances, but I will give their staff a lot of credit. And I think that really got lost in the Twitter thing.
I did that one time, by the way, when Doug Jones was a temporary senator before we hired Tommy Tuberville, you know, because football coaches are fantastic senator candidates.
Same with actors.
Yeah. So when Doug
We're
Jones,
all just a big team.
yeah, that's
America.
Right. Yeah. Let's go get a first down. So yeah, Doug Jones was a senator, and I just was like, I just want to walk in and tell you a little bit about what I think about crypto, and like whatever, some staffer that was in charge of finance stuff came and talked to me for a few minutes, and then nothing happened from it, but he gave me the opportunity, and I was like, I'll take that opportunity as a citizen of the state of Alabama to my representative who works for me. That's their job, that they're supposed to listen to us. And if enough people do that, then you might actually have an opportunity to make some change. So go talk to your freaking representatives, you know? They will also ignore you.
Some of the staffers like seem very tuned into crypto Twitter, because I was talking to Nomad about some of this stuff. I think it was it Emma who was like saying, Emma was like repeating some lines which seemed like very on topic, like his staffers like on crypto Twitter somewhere, like tagging Inverse Brow or something. And I was having a discussion about this, and I was like, can we figure out who are the people working for the staffers, and like just blending in with weird profile pictures. And after that, two different like someone from like a senator's staffer and someone from a House of Reps person staffer reached out and were like, oh, like, look, if you want to input on the bills and stuff, like, I was like, dude, I don't know what I'm talking about. Like, you've contacted the complete wrong person. Look at my profile picture. It's like a Santa Claus with like loads of blood on his face. It changes once a day. I don't know what I'm talking about. But like, they do seem like really open to talking to basically everyone, because I'm literally the bottom of the barrel for something like this.
You're totally right about. I mean, people love to point to the one, you know, member of the House or Senate who goes out of their depth, doesn't know what they're talking about, and says something, and then people go, "Oh, look how out of touch these people are. They'll never understand this technology. They're ancient. They're, you know, from a different world and a different generation." The fact of the matter, though, is that the staff of Congress is hugely influential in the way the member ultimately makes decisions, and that's the way it should be too. You need good people to make good arguments in order to be a judge of the value of those arguments on both sides. And there are staff members in Congress who are crazy good at learning about crypto, who are deeply interested in it. It used to be that it was fairly clear that you could participate in these technologies and use them. The ethics rules have gotten a lot cloudier lately, and that's actually a big problem, I think, because if the staff and the member, to the extent the member is interested, but certainly if the staff wants to use crypto in order to learn about it, they need to be able to use crypto in order to learn about it. I mean,
there are efforts by various software developers to try to create sort of closed test nets in some way, shape, or form. I know that's not ideal, and you want to make it in the system. I mean, I've definitely done an uptick in lots of demos, as have other people who are focused on DeFi in DC. But a demo where you're watching somebody else click doesn't feel the same as like, oh, I'm going to click and then something goes out of my wallet and it's irreversible. I mean, you could obviously bring it back depending on what you're doing.
They need to get rugged firsthand, don't they? They need to get rugged for real.
That is not what I was talking about.
Like, right, now I remove the LP. Yeah, now you've been rugged. Getting rugged on Corelli, it's not the same.
No, that's not what I'm saying. Although you're right, though, that I feel like a lot of them are very plugged in to, and a lot of regulators are watching what's going on in crypto Twitter. And I don't know if I think that's always a good thing. And
not
I
always
think,
a good thing.
Yeah, look, I mean, the other thing I'll say, not to be too much of a Pollyanna about it, but I grew up in the Midwest, so I do have some of that in me, is like, I don't want us to be publicly fighting as a space anymore. Like, let's try to reel that back a little bit, especially if we want to continue on building, growing, all that stuff that we were talking about. Like, let's find private venues. We can fight it out. I mean, Peter's a lawyer, I'm a lawyer. That's what we're all like built to do. So you can definitely have disagreements, but better not to do it on Twitter, I'd say, and you can definitely say what your opinions are, but and so I don't want to try to take people off of that, but I think trying to have a much more united and sort of adult front, although I think there's always room for Gabriel Haynes in our world, just from an entertainment point of view. But in all seriousness, I do want there to be sort of a cohesive vision of what things are going to look like in this space going forward. And regardless of whether people like this idea or not, there will be regulation in some way, shape, or form, not just of centralized entities, but I don't think it's politically viable anymore not to have some form of regulation in DeFi. So we have to put something forward that makes sense and won't shut down software developers. And for the software developers who are building in a responsible way, they're already doing a lot of that stuff anyway, right? Security audits, that's like one of the most important things and something I talk about a lot when I'm talking to regulators everywhere to understand, like when we're talking about this, when I said different risks, different regulations, like the cyber risk can be addressed through security audits. Will it be perfect? No, but the traditional financial system isn't perfect either. So I think we have to find proxies for things that happen in the traditional financial world and that we can make seem real, even if it feels uncomfortable to be moving into a more regulated and watched over system. But you can't just say no regulation because it's coming. And if you don't propose an alternative, you will allow the banks or people who do not understand the technology and the way it's being built to come up with regulations that will not be beneficial long term, at least for the builders.
Totally. There's an expression, if you're not at the table, you're on the table. And it's a good expression around Thanksgiving too. And frankly, if you're at the table, you might still be on the table as well. And I think this is something people are missing with the SBF thing, this like notion that like because he was coming to Washington, he's going to get special treatment now or something. I mean, I'm not a betting man, so I'm not going to put odds on it, but like fraud is fraud. And it doesn't matter if you donated a bunch of money to politicians. If it comes out that you stole customer funds, there's going to be consequences.
Yeah. Listen, if he gets like a light touch thing, I'm going to be radicalized, I think. Like the way the like puff piece media stuff was a little bit like, is this really happening? Like, how come they won't just call it what it is? It's kind of blown over a bit now. But if donating hundreds of millions of dollars to politicians actually just lets you get away with fraud, I'm going to become radicalized, I think. Like, surely the way it has to work is actually he gets punished more because of how blatant it is to just donate money and try and buy your freedom. Who knows? We'll see. I want to loop back a little bit to the OFAC stuff because you mentioned it was sanctioned, unsanctioned, resanctioned, and you have the chart of OFAC compliant Ethereum blocks, which has been like until recently like growing. I think it topped at like 80-90% or something and seems to be downtrending a little bit now. How do you think the industry and software engineers should be approaching like building a credibly neutral layer one in the environment where they've sanctioned a smart contract and like there is a lot of censorship on chain now. Like Tornado Clash blocks still get included, and they still get included in like 10 minutes or something, but 90% of the blocks were censoring those transactions for a long time. What do you think the future of this looks like? Is there a viable path where you can have neutrality on layer one with these sanctions in place?
Yeah, so this is a tough one. To be clear about CoinCenter's specific legal challenge, we are, in our complaint, we're saying, look, you've identified a series of addresses that are just smart contracts that have software within them that I could use to pay another American in an entirely legal and legitimate transaction. That can't be a sanctioned activity. And so our challenge is narrow and says you have to undesignate those immutable addresses because they're just software, and what you're really doing is stopping US persons from using them for their own personal privacy. That would be a good victory. But even if we were to have that victory, there are other addresses that are sanctioned, and we're not challenging those, both in the Tornado Cash context and in the context of past sanctions from cryptocurrency standpoint, like Blender.io was a custodial mixer that was sanctioned. There were 2 Iranians who were running some ransomware software, and their Bitcoin addresses were sanctioned. So there are going to be sanctioned addresses that are legitimately sanctioned under the law, that we wouldn't be able to challenge on the same theory we're challenging the Tornado Cash addresses. And that's probably the right outcome, because Americans, to the extent that we use sanctions policies for our foreign policy, sanctions for our foreign policy purposes, Americans shouldn't be paying Iranians who are aiding their weapons programs and things like this. So what does it look like then to be a miner or a validator on these networks, where periodically someone's going to put a transaction in the mempool that is to one of these sanctioned addresses? And let's say you're a US person as a miner or a validator. There are carve-outs from OFAC's powers. They're called the Berman Amendments, and they're named after Congressman Berman, Senator Berman, I think. I should know that for a fact, who said, look, we have the Trading with the Enemy Act, which is actually the original statute here, very ominous sounding, because who should be trading with the enemy? Absolutely no one. And we have the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, and these are important tools, but this is America. And so if you are importing or exporting political pamphlets into Cuba or out of Cuba, especially if they're about liberal democracy, but frankly, if they're about anything that has to do with free expression and an open society, then you should be allowed to make those transactions, because the way we win in the long run and beat illiberal regimes is by being open, and by allowing commerce, especially commerce in information and the free exchange of ideas. So OFAC has carve-outs for something like a credible, neutral base layer for international transactions. I believe that. That's my interpretation of the Berman Amendments, and that is not yet tested in court. So do not rely on my statements if you are thinking about validating a chain and putting a bunch of sanctioned transactions in a block. But I think that's exactly the kind of statutory law hook that is necessary to have a reasonable sanctions regime that rightly blocks people from paying known terrorists, but doesn't block people from engaging in activity that's neutral and is just about the free exchange of information and technology, and even money if it's for legitimate purposes, because the vast majority of transactions in the blockchain are not criminal and they're not related to terrorism. And so that argument's going to have to be made in court, probably one day. OFAC hasn't forced the issue. They haven't started coming after or offering strict interpretations of the amount of liability that a base layer validator is going to face. But if you ask an OFAC attorney, they're going to say, don't even touch that stuff. They're going to take a very conservative perspective, and that's what they should do, because they need to protect their client. But somebody, I think, is probably going to want to do this on ideological grounds because they believe in incredibly neutral base layers. And they're maybe going to be brave enough to ask OFAC for clarity. And when denied the freedom to do that, if they are denied the freedom to do that, they'll need to fight it in court on both the statutory law ground, interpreting the Berman Amendments, and on the constitutional ground, because the Berman Amendments actually reflect our First Amendment rights to the free exchange of information.
Representative Berman.
Not Senator. Thank you.
No problem. My question on this is that, and this is part of where Eric and Sam went to bat, which was over the difference in speech and finance, and the free, in the right to do these things and participate in these networks. So he made the comparison to email, and should Gmail or email be outlawed because of the form of communication criminals will use versus finance. What kind of nuance is available there? Like, how can we defend the right to privacy in finance this in a similar fashion to the way the right to privacy from a communications perspective is very clear already?
So there's a literature on money as speech. It's a contentious literature in the US because it brings up some deep-seated political divides between left and right in campaign finance and whether corporations should be able to donate. That's the Citizens United case. There's also a more interesting literature that speaks most directly to not just the speech concern and the assembly concern, but to the privacy concern that you raise. And this is probably best embodied by Alabama versus NAACP, which is a path-breaking case back in the 1960s.
Why are we
where
always
Getting
Alabama,
home.
Yeah, we're always involved. I don't know why.
Oh, that's right. So your state's got some interesting history here, as I'm sure you're aware.
Yeah.
They wanted lists of all of the active members and agitators in the NAACP during the Civil Rights Movement. And they didn't want those lists for the right reasons. We know that for a fact, because it was a segregationist state government. It was Jim Crow. And so the NAACP, being really brave folks who were standing up for the right things, of course, refused to give those lists, broke the law, in effect, although an unjust law isn't a law, maybe. And they took it all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, Alabama, you can't do that. There is a right to anonymous assembly. There is a right to anonymous donations, even, in our Constitution. And it's embedded in the First Amendment, which says, look, you're only going to get people out there protesting if they feel like they can work together, coordinate together, make donations to the same cause without their names immediately ending up on a list and the reprisals that inevitably follow. And so you have a constitutional right to anonymous assembly. And that, to me, is where you will find, I think, the strongest arguments in favor of base layer privacy and base layer censorship resistance being core to the sort of project that is the American open society. I mean, not to be like grand, but like these networks embody our ideals in a fundamental way, that you can be punished after the fact for doing something bad with a communications technology. And God knows SBF should be, if he's actually as guilty as some of the facts seem to indicate. But you can't be prior restrained from using those networks based on some bureaucratic idea of what should be and should not be published on those networks. So that base layer censorship resistant function is, I think, core to our American civil libertarianism, if you will. And I want to see that vindicated in the long run.
I do think, though, base layer is a little different than what you're talking about in terms of like finance, right? And while I don't think, I strongly believe software developers should never be turned into financial intermediaries, and it's something I say all the time, and you can't touch the writing of code because obviously that's protected by the First Amendment. Deploying something into a commercial state is different than just writing it. I know Peter's, and so you have to really think about that. And so when I at least think about, are we going to regulate DeFi? What do? You have to think, well, at what point in time does it make sense to regulate it? Certainly not in the writing of code, and certainly not after you've deployed it into a decentralized state, right? Because then you're turning software developers into financial intermediaries. But there is this like critical point in time. And I don't know if I've ever said it this publicly before, right before you deploy, if you know you're deploying it into a state that is going to be used for a certain purpose, you do probably have certain obligations. They're not the obligations of a custodian or a centralized exchange or any of those things, but it's like what I was talking about before. Let's find proxies for ways to protect financial markets, consumer, and engage with consumer protection and things like that, like security audits, like very robust notice and disclosure, including about if there's a token, what does it do? What does it mean? Also, if there's a multi-sig, what does the multi-sig do? How are the powers deployed? When can those powers be deployed? Things like that are pretty, they don't seem like what they will shut down DeFi, and they do seem like they will bring a lot more transparency and protection into the space than maybe exists there already. Now, I would say a lot of the best software developers are already doing things like security audits. We certainly do them. Stani is a huge believer in security. He says, DeFi is mission critical software, so you should treat it like you're launching a rocket into space and be that precise about it. So we are. But look, not every project has the money to be able to do, 3-4 security audits. They're very expensive. But there are ways to do that. And the other thing, I think I'll say this, but I'll be transparent and it will probably be very unpopular. But the way audits are dealt with now is you just know who has the best reputation, and so you use them. But there should be some sort of standard that people know and abide by, at least when you're getting your audits done. And you should be public about your audits and about how you addressed them, right? Because we had this, I can't remember the hack, but there was like some hack that happened 18 months ago or something like that. And they were like, but we got a security audit done. And then the audit firm came out and they were like, but you didn't do what we told you to do to fix it. And so, and like there was I remember this whole podcast listening to the auditors defend themselves to be like, no, like here's the report, here's what it said, we identified the problem and you never fixed it after we gave it to you. But like these seem like very basic things that developers are almost already doing or would not severely restrict, you know, how they go about doing it. So I think you have to be pretty, you have to be intellectually honest too. Like, especially when you're talking to regulators and policymakers, like Peter was saying at the beginning, like, have we solved all the problems and have we banked the unbanked with crypto yet? No, we haven't. So you can't go there and say like, listen, it's fixed all our problems. You have to say, this has the potential to, let me give you some smaller use case examples, because those do exist now, especially for things like donations. There are lots of great projects who are definitely doing payment experiments in developing countries for refugees and the like. So you got to find those really good use cases. And, you know, use those to start, and then be honest about where it makes sense to, you know, maybe impose some restrictions or some requirements before you go forward. And this idea of the standard setting regime, like, have you conducted an audit? Let's disclose it. What other standards are you abiding by? It's definitely something they're talking about in Europe and the UK, and seems to be sort of one of the most feasible paths forward.
You're talking.
I'm really afraid to check Twitter after this, because I'm sure I'll get just excoriated. But yeah.
And I don't know if this will be evident to the audience, but I actually agree with everything you just said, Rebecca. I think, and our points are not. You too, then. Our points are not in opposition to each other, though. My point about a sort of an area of activity where you have the right to do it without prior restraint, which. And, you know, a mandatory disclosure regime before publishing something is kind of prior restrainty, right? To make up a bad adverb. What I'm talking about as far as where you have an area of right or freedom to do something without prior restraint is the bare minimum. Publishing software, like what Satoshi did, putting a protocol out there and publishing a white paper. And I also believe, and this was our conversation earlier that Cobie started about sort of the validators and the miners on the network, that base layer, like what are their obligations? I believe they should be able to pass information, already validly signed transactions, order them into blocks and publish those. I believe that's also something that's sort of core to this First Amendment activity, the ability to assemble into a peer-to-peer network that does something. Where we get into harder, you know, troubling waters is where you've done other things in addition to publishing software or validating the chain, where you've also made promises to investors, where you've made promises or marketing materials that users rely upon, where you've made guarantees. At that point, you're engaged in commercial behavior. And of course, there might be expressive elements of that commercial behavior that might warrant some level of First Amendment protection. But at the end of the day, if what you're doing is conduct, i.e. something that really changes the world, people come to rely on your statements and they make material investments upon those reliances, then you don't get the same kind of unquestionable First Amendment protections in this country. Burning a flag is expressive, but you can definitely be arrested for burning too many flags in the lobby of a building, because it's just a goddamn public safety hazard for obvious reasons. So that line, the division between purely publishing code or relaying transactions on the network and then doing something more, that's the hardest area here.
Yeah.
And it's going to be really messy sorting that out. And what my point about the sort of constitutional or fundamental rights to engage in the formation of these networks is really about the far end of that spectrum, where we're really just talking about research activities, publishing activities, and forming a network, not anything else necessarily, like making promises about the usage of your tools.
What do y'all think about the different arguments where, you know, some people say, well, we have a lot of rules in place to determine stuff, you know, what's a security or what's legal or not legal or whatever, versus we need a whole new framework, or we need a whole new division, to your point earlier, Peter, about, you know, yet another organization to regulate something. Where do you kind of fall in line?
It's a great question. Yeah. So like, I'm generally against technology specific laws or new regimes crafted around new technologies, because I think they're often chronically outdated from the day they're published, right? Because the technology changes so quickly. If you try and ossify parts of it in the United States code, good luck how people will interpret that in just 5 years. the U.S. data privacy laws, most of them were drafted back in the 1980s, so they have more to say about what happens when you drive up to a processing facility with a trunk full of hard drives and whether they can share your data or not. They say nothing, of course, about Twitter, which was invented not actually all that long after the law was passed. Technology just moves really quickly and the laws move really slowly. And some of these regimes, like the securities laws regimes and the flexible standard for what is and is not a security, the so-called Howey test that we talk about sort of ad nauseum in DC and in crypto policy circles, are actually pretty darn good in the sense that they tee up the right base layer questions about economic arrangements without specifically mentioning whether it's a token or whether it's a currency or some arbitrary industry jargon like designation. So it's good to have technology neutral laws. The issue with the securities laws is, to my mind, not actually the flexible standard for what is and is not a security. It's what happens once your thing is a security. And that aspect of US securities laws is not very technology neutral because it makes all kinds of assumptions about how securities have to trade through a market. They have to go through clearing houses. They have to go through transfer agents. They have to go through all of these regulated parties who did have to exist in the past, but in many cases do not have to exist now because the blockchain as a peer-to-peer settlement layer kind of removes the need for them. And so the issue with your token being classified as a security is less that it's not a security or is a security. It's that the collateral consequences mean that it's not going to be able to trade anywhere except a registered national securities exchange, which means you'll have to get the Industry Association of National Securities Exchanges to create listing standards. And it's the apparatus there is not modern and is not technology neutral. So I would like a flexible and sort of old regime in the sense of a neutral standard for when something is a security or not. But we need to rethink, or have an SEC that's willing to rethink, how much of the apparatus in the middle and the regulated parties in the middle are still necessary, rather than forcing these market activities to go through structures that are completely obsolete. And now they're just going to be rent seekers. They're just going to take fees because of their monopoly that they get from government regulation.
Yeah, the other piece of it, I'll say, just listening to Peter talk about it and then thinking about, how our system has always worked historically, the legacy financial system, is it's mostly excluded retail, right, from any new types of financial markets, financial tools, financial instruments. And so if you bring this all back to the ways we've always done it, then you're going to take away what crypto was actually intended to be. Now, it wasn't meant to be, as you sort of joked about, Cobie, like rug pulls on retail, and that we need to do things that prevent that. But I also think we need to be super focused on the fact that, like, we don't want to take away the possibility for people to participate in the financial markets in a new way, just by going back to an old regime. I'm not a big believer in, like, let's create a totally new agency and things like that, especially, as Peter was saying earlier, like, we're very, especially in the US, we're so decentralized. I don't think we need yet another regulator to deal with this, but we may need to cut across a number of different regulators to get this done in the right way. And we may need to be more creative than we have been, just to say, like, it's a security and a securities exchange, and then it just looks exactly, it does exactly the same. Because if we do that, then we've taken away the possibility for people to really participate in what I think people are trying to build as something new and different and expand out our financial markets. And to just take it away from, like, finance and DeFi, things like decentralized social media and these other primitives are letting, like, even NFTs are letting people participate in the economy in a way they never could before, at a point in time in their life that they never could before. And, like, that is what's really interesting, right? Like, maybe DAOs are the future of work. Maybe NFTs are the way people are going to, like, make money, going forward, and people will become living artists again and not just be starving artists and stuff. So, like, I don't want to lose sight of all that. Peter and I are lawyers. It's a lot of what we do, and we talk about the policy stuff, but, like, I am here for the broader mission. I know it's sort of cheesy, but, like, I think, especially after going through this, like, huge existential, but, like, going through this, I mean, FTX was very existential for me. I really thought, like, are we all here? Like, what are we all here for? Like, this is not what I was here for. And quite frankly, before I started doing policy work, I wasn't even that focused on FTX and other, like, centralized exchanges, except when I needed them to on and off ramp. It just wasn't something I was thinking about. And I just want to make sure, like, we keep in mind what we're actually working towards, or what what's interesting about this and stop being mired in all the like, what is it?
I think that's what frustrates me a bit is there's a pretty clear pathway to say, let's spend, some hundreds of millions of dollars to establish regulatory capture to fit these centralized systems to trade these decentralized concepts and do the SBF path, right? And what FTX was doing. And in some ways, it's like, well, I want to participate, so sure, I'll use FTX and FTX US, and they get all the stuff, and that's the path. And then he rugs me, and it's like, oh crap. So it didn't actually fix anything. Versus like, well, I can trade a token that someone created on Uniswap the next day, or like buy an NFT or borrow on Aave, and these things just work. And you don't need to be in any of those systems, but give me the clarity that I can actually use them without breaking some law. You know what I mean? Like, am I breaking the law as a user? Is the person publishing the software that enables these efficient systems breaking the law as a creator? And the U.S. is not making that clear. And for someone that owns, or not forget owns a company, like just publishes code or works on a team that publishes code, it's really hard to do it as an American. And I know other regions have similar problems, but like I'm an American, so for me and my company or whatever, like doing certain stuff is complicated because even though it's efficient and it works, I don't know what my government allows me to do, and that seems that's very frustrating.
Well, and it's interesting you bring that up because there's a lot of other things that have piggybacked U.S. policy-wise on the presumption that there will always be financial intermediaries. And the biggest one is our current sort of financial surveillance apparatus, which presumes that Americans will make most of the consequential transactions in their lives via some sort of regulated third party who will collect information about them, identify them to regulators, file suspicious activity reports, all without a warrant, which is quite interesting. We kind of don't have Fourth Amendment rights against warrantless search in any of our financial activities. We gave that up in the 1970s when we started doing more intermediated transactions. And we really gave it up in the 90s when we started doing all of our transactions using, Bank of America or Venmo or Alipay or WeChat. And so taking away the intermediaries isn't, even if it's good for investor protection, which it is in some cases, because you don't deal with this counterparty risk in the same way, it's going to be difficult for law enforcement and or the policy arms of Treasury that set anti-money laundering policy, because they've come to depend upon this mountain of data they get from their regulated intermediaries to detect crime in the financial system and stop it. And it's not like it's always been this way. We didn't live in a lawless society in the early 20th century when almost all financial transactions were done using bearer instruments. Things were okay. I mean, there were lots of systemic injustices, but those were actually not related to the bearer instruments, I would argue. And so can we go back to that? What will be the sort of resistance from folks who've become very reliant and dependent on that flow of very private information to those changes? What will happen? And then the other one, really briefly, that actually causes the most problems for your average American person who's using these networks is taxes. Because in a world where you have a broker or a dealer or a company like Robinhood or something in between you and your financial trades, you have third-party reporting, and they calculate your cap gains, and you get that nice form from them at the end of the year, and you're like, well, I don't like paying my taxes, but at least I know what I owe. Whereas in a world where you're doing all of your transactions on DeFi, and you might have had like leveraged NFT clams or something like that, and at the end of the day, you're like, oh, wait, I have to pay my taxes? Great. Who's going to tell me what I owe? And there isn't. Yeah. So maybe that can be fixed with software, but right now the tax code is just a nightmare. So hopefully it can just be fixed with software, but I think we should also start thinking about simpler tax codes that are a little bit more fair and don't have so many weird loopholes and carve outs that you need a tax attorney to figure out what's happening at the end of the day. But the software's a good chip, it's too optimistic probably what I'm asking for.
Maybe, but there is a lot of software being built that deals with all of this. So first of all, I always say when we're thinking about the illicit finance stuff, like we're in a closed system, right? Like you really can't, we live in a fiat dominated world, whether we like it or not. And so to get in or out of it, you need to be able to on or off ramp through a centralized intermediary. That is where you can do very, very significant KYC and have a lot of the information that you've had before. The blockchain analytics companies have or use lots of different information that helps with tracking. Yes, is it perfect and under the BSA? Probably not, but there's a lot of good information out there, and we're early still. And the other thing I'll say is on the illicit finance side, people are building out low-level user-enabled blacklist. When I say low-level, I mean, like base layer or even protocol layer, user-enabled blacklist. So you say like, oh, I don't want to transact with anybody in this pool who may have, a wallet that's been sanctioned or something like that, or is associated with a sanctioned actor. And in DeFi, because it is very much like how we interact with cash, although with maybe more complex financial tools or primitives, you can then use tools that look a lot like what you would do in cash. Like, all right, if I give Peter $20, probably don't need to check if he's on the SDN list. But if I give him $200,000, even just in a peer-to-peer transaction, probably should. And so you need to think about a lot of this is user enabled. Now, it's funny because when you talk to other regulators, they say like, yeah, but letting individuals deal with their own financial independence isn't always a good thing, right? Like retail frequently doesn't know how to protect itself. I think we have seen a lot of that in crypto, maybe in less favorable ways, right? With a lot of the scams, rug pulls and stuff like that. But we have, like, if we're going to be true to what the system is being built on, then you have to say like, okay, yeah, we need to do illicit, we need to at least have some tools that enable monitoring for illicit finance and things that, other regulators are used to seeing, but they just won't look exactly the same. I know I keep saying the same thing over and over, but like you can do all this. But a lot of what you're saying, Peter, it's done through technology. And like there are these tax tools that you embed into your MetaMask, whether let's put aside whether you want to do that or not, and that will spit something out at you tax-wise at the end of the year. So like this all exists. It's all being built out. I think the real problem is it's like crypto has captured everyone's psyche, and now especially with FTX. But let's say even pre-FTX, crypto had captured people's psyche in a way that was like almost bigger than definitely bigger than the maturity of the industry. And so the expectations were, well, where is everything to do all this now? And it's like, well, like we can meme it out, but like we're still early. So I think, there's some of that stuff going on.
All right, so hear me out. Let's say I bought a forklift for $10,000 cash. Can I sell coupons for $200 a day for people to borrow my forklift as a fractionalized piece of equipment?
Yeah,
there's inherent,
but
there's some good utility.
But what do you get for what do they get for that?
They get the utility of the forklift for the day.
Okay, and then do they get anything else? Like, does the value of the coupon go up? Or something?
I also give them free popcorn for their rental.
I'm confident that one's not a security.
Not a security.
But I will say, you bought this forklift for $10,000 in cash. Who did you buy it from? If you don't know their name, social security number, and home address and file a form 8300 to the IRS, you're guilty of a crime.
All right. See you later, guys.
and this is actually going to be true in the crypto space because of the infrastructure bill. The 6050I report, which is this cash transaction over $10,000 report, is now going to apply to crypto starting in 2024. And that's going to be a huge mess. That's another lawsuit that we're currently running, is challenging the constitutionality of that reporting requirement for ordinary people. This isn't about bank secrecy regulated intermediaries. This is ordinary people engaged in arm's length financial transactions will have to start learning a whole lot of intimate details about their counterparties and reporting them to the IRS.
Yeah, I have seen that recently about was it Venmo transactions? Like if people are, for a long time it's been if you've accepted more than $600 or something like that in transactions, you're supposed to report it, and they're apparently going to crack down on Venmo. And it's just kind of wild to me. Like, what if you get a really big tip on Venmo, and like, what do? Like, chase them down? I was just the valet for this same person like 80 times. They really liked coming to our restaurant, but it added up. Turns out my tips were more than $600. So, Mr. Johnson, could you please give me your social security number?
And Venmo is an MSB, right? So they're Bank Secrecy Act regulated. And so their obligations are a lot stricter than the obligations of an ordinary person who don't have many obligations. They have to report these cash-like transactions over $10,000, and they have to obey OFAC. They're not allowed to pay sanctioned persons. A BSA regulated entity like Venmo has so many requirements under the Bank Secrecy Act that, and their business is about making money, right? And compliance is a cost function in their business. That this is why you see just accounts get closed all the time. It's because if somebody is not making money for you as a customer and they're engaged in a few transactions that they're not providing enough information on as a business decision, they'll just close that account. This is sort of core to the trade-off between real financial inclusion and a robust anti-money laundering regime, is that they work in opposites. And you'll find people even in Treasury who agree that they work in opposites, and we need to find some balance, not over KYCing and over compliancing things such that people can't get accounts anymore, or they get debanked. But that's a whole discussion already in the traditional legacy financial sector, if you will. And crypto really forces these issues, because there may now be a way for people to pay each other peer-to-peer and not go through those intermediaries. And that can be a very good thing in some cases, where there's somebody who was wrongly removed from the financial system because they're in an oppressive regime, or because they don't have robust identity, for many, many reasons. Or it can be a bad thing because maybe they should actually not have the benefit of the financial system, which is why I really like Rebecca's point.
Like Canadian truckers.
The Canadian truckers are an example. I like Rebecca's point about user-defined lists. Like, at the end of the day, I don't want a world where Venmo is the ultimate arbiter of whether or not a person can, send money across the world. I don't want a world where the government is the ultimate arbiter of whether you get the benefit of financial services, at least not without a trial, at least not before I'm convicted of a crime. And all of these de-risking programs happen before anyone's actually convicted. It's just like, that customer seems too dodgy, so we'll just kick them off. I want a world where people can sort of voluntarily assemble into groups and police themselves. And that is a cool thing about DeFi, is if you really believe that as an American, you shouldn't, maybe for legal reasons, but also for ethical or moral reasons, be transacting with certain other people. Maybe you set that policy for yourself and you have a group of people who set that policy alongside you. That's a pretty cool way of organizing a compliance regime. It is very alien, though, I think, to regulators. And so it's going to be interesting.
Yeah. And there are people, this is not as an attractive as point as the one Peter and I were sort of talking about and idealizing about, but there are also people building out software that will sort of plug into DeFi and be able to spit out things like SARs and stuff like that. So it's all being built out. And I will say there's been a lot of, VC investment in crypto native compliance too. Whatever you want to say about that, that's out there. So, people are building. Cobie, you're so quiet.
Listen,
why are you so
I was
quiet?
just letting you guys that know what you're talking about talk. But I do want to ask, what do you think the future holds? Are we going to bifurcate into regulated RegFi and DarkFi, where we've got KYC'd front ends to use Uniswap on one hand, and then on the other they use IPFS to host all these non-compliant front ends that are censor resistant and you can't take them down or whatever. I don't know how the interplanetary file system actually works, but is there going to be a big bifurcation? Are we all just going to trade on Binance for the rest of our lives and CZ becomes like God Emperor and BNB is bigger than Bitcoin? What does the future hold in your opinion?
I think the worst outcome is if the regulations are enforced in a very black letter manner, and to the extent they demand the continued existence of centralized intermediaries and people push to outlaw or limit the availability of decentralized alternatives, that's the worst outcome, because then we all end up beholden to whoever runs those centralized intermediaries, to make a reference to what you were just suggesting as a sort of apocalypse. I think bifurcation sounds kind of strange and maybe bad, but it could be good in a certain sense. If you have base layer neutrality and you have a world where there are regulated front ends and a lot of things, if you can find a way to protect privacy in the process, that would be important. Like maybe you can use zero knowledge proofs to determine if someone's on the SDN list rather than just taking their name and social security number and all kinds of other messy things about that data. That's a nuanced point. But generally speaking, if you have, to some extent, sort of compliance at the user interface level, but there's still an ability to use the rails for sophisticated persons or persons in need. That's not a bad outcome. It was one of the things that looks like is everyone's playing on the same network. In regimes that are open and democratic, most people are very happy then to play on the regulated rails. In regimes that are oppressive and totalitarian, the regulated aspect of that system, the licensed front ends, if you will, or the places where you can actually use the things, will be so censored to the point where people won't use them because they won't be able to get money out of their country, or they won't be able to support civil disobedience. And those people hopefully will have the tool set, the software, and the raw network access ability to be subversive in that environment and make transactions that the regulated front ends don't allow. Like, that's not a bad outcome. It would be still freedom enhancing, I think, especially with respect to totalitarian governments and oppressive regimes.
Rebecca, what do you reckon the future holds?
I hope we can come up with something that doesn't have some sort of dark pool thing like you're talking about, and some, highly regulated state. I think in an ideal world, and this is what I was trying to say before, is like, and what Peter was saying, like, take a seat at the table, come up with some proposals. It's not going to be perfect, right? It's just not. We're going to have to give, or if we want to keep moving forward, we may have to give up something in a regulated state, and I don't want to have to give up too much. So I think we should take a seat at the table and make some proposals that make sense going forward. So the interesting thing is, I've spoken to various sort of regulators around the world, and some of them do think this like opt-in standard setting regime for DeFi is going to make a lot of sense. There's not a lot of self-regulation in countries other than the United States. It's not a huge thing that people believe in. But I do think if we sort of mandate something that makes sense and that also addresses what I keep talking about, financial stability, market integrity, consumer protection, illicit finance, you have to make a compelling case. But I'm hoping we can keep building in a way that makes a lot of sense.
It seems like there has to be a path where you're not creating like two internets, you're allowing the system.
There are two internets, maybe three today, you know what I mean? And not like Web 3, but like there are multiple Web 2 internets. Like, I mean, not everybody participates in all of the different internets that are out there. But, I think we can live in an idealist state and say, look, this is all meant to be censorship resistant. I didn't mean to cut you off, but like, no, this is all meant to be changing everything. And so we won't take anything less than that. But I'm pretty committed to the fact that this can and has the potential to change the way we do things and enable people to live somewhat differently than we do now. And, I grew up in the middle of America. And so and you're in Birmingham, I think there are a lot of different ways people live, and I'd like there to be, and I'm sure this is very idealistic, but I'd like to have everybody have the opportunity to do more. I think, go ahead.
I think the part that frustrates me about it is what that actually ends up being. It's one thing for the interface or like my interaction on the shallow end is different. But when it affects like my capacity as a rule follower to get liquidity, as an example, very clear example. If I used FTX US, I don't get the same liquidity as FTX.com. If I use Binance US, I don't get the same liquidity as Binance.com. If I use Kraken's US platform, I don't get the same liquidity as Kraken's like other liquidity. And I shouldn't be punished for my ability to effectively financially transact for following a rule set, right? Like, it seems like the liquidity.
You want to make sure your funds are there, though. So you might have to.
But that's where the smart to me, it seems like that's where the technology can lead, right? Like the technology can enable everyone to use the same general tool set, have this access to liquidity. But as a rule follower, I shouldn't be punished in my financial like capacity, whether it's liquidity or something else, versus people who are living outside the system they have much greater access from a tool set perspective or whatever else. Like, I feel like that is a unnecessary burden where my ability to just opt out and go use the other thing and say, I'm going to participate in the other one because it's better in every way. See, it's like making me now not a rule follower when I want to be a rule follower. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but the world is inherently unfair, and hopefully to your point, that some of this decentralized software will change those, and maybe that's what your point is.
That is my point.
Decentralized software, can change some of those paradigms, and that's why I'm saying, like, let's not regulate it exactly like we do everything else, but let's address the kinds of concerns that regulators, policymakers have in a way that allows the software to continue on.
Yeah.
Ledger, how do you feel about taking questions from the chat? Do you think this is do you think they're going to have good, intelligent policy?
There was
questions?
there were a couple. One was about the library case, if y'all are familiar with that and like what the implications are. I don't know enough about it, but that was one that came up a couple times, and I said I would ask it. So we can start there. But I think the chat that's with us is in it for the conversation. So sure.
Sure, you want questions, or do you want us to talk about library?
Yeah, I'd love a little bit of a TLDR on library.
Okay. Peter, I'll take it unless you want to. Okay. So the library case, LBRY, was a case, many that we've seen in SEC enforcement action. It was in, I think, the District of New Hampshire, so a smaller court. And it was about whether the token that library had issued was a security. The court found on summary judgment. So they went through this full process, right? The SEC filed a complaint. Then they went through what's called discovery, where you exchange documents. The SEC probably didn't exchange most documents because when you're in enforcement actions, you don't really get a lot of discovery from the regulator. So they got a lot of discovery from library. And then they had motions for summary judgment saying that the library token and secondary sales of it were securities. This is a lot like some of the issues both that we've seen in the Kick and Telegram cases and that's pending in Ripple. Obviously, some different facts and circumstances, and everything with Aave is a facts and circumstances case. The interesting thing about the library case is that it was a pre-mine instead of an ICO, and so they sold actual tokens. And they sold them to accredited investors, so through what's thought of as an exempt securities offering. But the court ended up finding that a lot of the statements that the core team had made and some of the promises about what the token would do, or about what the software would do, and why the token would be valuable, ended up making. And the court said, and this is what I think is the most controversial part, that even if the team had never said a word, there would still be an expectation of profit, given that the team had pre-mined the tokens and sold them before the technology was ever built, and the team was at least committed to building the technology. I think that is probably a larger reach than what exists in the Aave case law today. But that's essentially where the court ended up. And so on summary judgment, that's a final determination. You could appeal it up to a higher court. I think is New Hampshire in the First Amendment, in the First Circuit? I don't remember, but you'd appeal it up to the circuit court, and then whatever happens there, you could appeal it up to the Supreme Court. But it's a final determination on the merits. So it's pretty significant in the fact that it's a final determination. Again, just like Kick and Telegram, it's a district court case right now in the District of New Hampshire, but it is a case that other courts could rely on when they're looking at similar facts and circumstances about whether a token is a security or not under an SEC enforcement action.
Cobie, have you seen any?
The only thing I'd add.
Go ahead.
The only thing I'd add is I agree that merely the fact that they owned a fair amount of the token is enough to prove expectation of profits, because therefore they will work to make the token better because they own it. I think that's a rather extreme interpretation of the relevant law. And then the other thing is the judge basically said there's been these claims that people are buying the token because they want to use them for the functionality on the network. And we don't even need to investigate those claims because that's not relevant to the legal question at hand. I think that was because there's a factual inquiry as to like whether the token does things and whether people are seeking the token because they want to actually say make smart contracts on the Ethereum blockchain, for example, or something like that. But the judge said we don't need to go into the factual inquiry because it's not relevant to the question of whether it's a security or not. I think it is relevant to the question of whether something's a security. And then you could find that actually it wasn't useful at all, and therefore it still is a security. But the judge didn't entertain that factual inquiry.
Cobie, did you catch any good questions?
I got a couple on Telegram from people. How risky is it to be a developer in DeFi today, and how risky is it to start a DAO that does DeFi today? And, all from the same person, if I'm based in the US, do I just need to leave the US if I want to like build in crypto because I don't know what I'm doing?
I mean, I'll just briefly say one thing about being a developer. If you're developing privacy protecting tools, it seems like very scary because as we've discussed briefly, there's a developer of the Tornado Cash protocol who's sitting in jail in the Netherlands and hasn't been charged yet. And in that case, I would rather be a US person because we don't know all the facts. He hasn't even been charged. We don't know all the facts of what he may or may not have done either. But if all you did was publish smart contract code that allows people to maintain their own privacy while using a network like Ethereum, and you did nothing else, in the US, you'd both have the courtesy of law enforcement having to charge you with something rather than holding you for hundreds of days without charges. And you'd have the First Amendment, which is, there are speech rights in European countries. I'm not denying the existence of speech rights, but the First Amendment is a much more robust area of constitutional law here in the US. And so you would have, I think, very good defenses that if you were to be held responsible merely for publishing code, you could argue that that's a prior restraint on your First Amendment rights. So there are some reasons to be in the US if you're a DeFi developer who's merely publishing code, which I would argue is the truest way of being a DeFi developer, is if you're not doing a lot of other things beyond publishing software. There are other complications like the securities laws issues that might make the US less appealing, of course.
Yeah, my answer to that is that it's just like, it depends. Like, it depends what you're building, right? It depends on how it's deployed. It depends on how decentralized it is. One of the things we've sort of glossed over or haven't really talked about at all is like, there is this concept, or this idealism that DeFi is truly decentralized. And, there's been a lot of skepticism around that. And that's correct, I think, in many ways, because decentralization is really hard. And so if you just say like, oh, it's DeFi because it's operating on smart contracts, but you like hold the admin key and engage in transactions with users and, do all these other things and market it and the like, you may have liability in a different way than if you deployed it to a truly decentralized state. And Peter's point about like, well, being a true, like a just writing code is the, most authentic way to be a DeFi software developer is probably right. And there are definitely protocols out there where everything was published to GitHub and someone else used the deploy remit and put it out there, from a third party or a non-way and things like that. So it depends on what you're building. If you're building a derivatives protocol and you're going to run it in the United States and they're going to be US persons and it's not that decentralized, it's probably very risky to do it because certain types of derivatives need to be registered with the CFTC. You need to have only certain types of persons on the platform. You can't sell derivatives to retail, things like that. But it really depends on what you're building and then how decentralized it's actually going to be. DAOs are a bit different. And I think this is sort of referring back to UkiDAO, which we didn't, in the case that the CFTC brought against UkiDAO, which we didn't touch on at all. And we're like now hitting 2 hours and this has gone by very quickly. But that also depends on what the DAO is doing. And unfortunately, the facts of that case are pretty tough to overcome because you have the statement that the founders made to say, you guys are just going to do the exact same thing we were doing and when we were running the business, but we're just going to do this for regulatory arbitrage. I don't know if it gets much worse than that. That's a pretty damning statement. But to just participate in a DAO generally depends on what you're doing. If you're voting to run a derivatives protocol that is being offered to US retail, yeah, that might be pretty risky. But if you are just, voting give a grant to a software developer who's building on top of the protocol, maybe not as risky. But it really depends ultimately what the protocol does and if there are prohibitions on doing that in the United States if they're in the US. And also, as I said, whether it's really decentralized, because that's the hardest one. It's the hardest thing to actually do from a practical standpoint, is decentralize the ecosystem around the protocol. And we have to be pretty honest with ourselves about how difficult that is. It's also very difficult for software developers to sort of give up something that they've put a lot of like sweat and tears into building, understandably, because they care about it. But, you know, I think the decentralization point is one that we haven't talked about and that we can't miss when we're talking about how much risk there's involved in DeFi. If it's not really decentralized, there's a lot of risk that you're just running a centralized, whatever it may be, derivatives exchange, security exchange, whatever, in name only, right? This Dino concept, decentralized in name only.
Maybe a crude question. Do-Kwon, Suzu, Kyle, SBF, Alex Mashinsky. How many of them go to jail?
I'm not weighing in on that.
I'm not a betting man.
Over under on half. I'd take the under.
Now you're getting. I think we got into a good place that we're only declining questions at the end of this podcast.
Well, I still
you guys have gotten us to a good place far.
I do kind of have one more question, because I feel like there's an element of crypto that's still like really weird to settle. Maybe not with us, but with authorities or like regulators and whatnot, which is just the general idea. Like, I have a $20 bill right here, right? And that is cash.
What? Don't flex on us.
Yeah.
Cobie, I got a bigger flex for you. You ready?
Okay. Yeah.
All right. This is $600. Okay.
Okay.
So this is the magic number, right, Peter? Of like, what is, you know, sorry, here you go. Proof of hundreds. So 600 plus 20. Now, like, if I transact this, I am perfectly capable of doing this transaction. I can hand this to someone to pay for a service, but I then have to self-report this. But my right to transact this cash privately is still there. I may have certain obligations of like tax paying or reporting or whatever after the fact, but I have that right to do that. And it doesn't seem like we have it very clear in terms of how that works when you're doing it with crypto, or like how some regulator thinks you're supposed to be able to do that and like determine what you're allowed or not allowed to do in a crypto sense. Does that, you know what I'm saying? Like, it seems weird.
Fundamentally, you have a capability of doing it in the real world because you don't have someone constantly shadowing you and binding your hands if you decide to hand your $600 to the wrong person. And that kind of world would be awful. That would be the most intrusive, Orwellian, totalitarian regime we can imagine. Online, you don't have that physical capability until crypto comes along, right? Online, the only way to make a transaction is to use an intermediary. And an intermediary, if it's worth using, is going to be big enough and connected enough that, of course, it's going to end up heavily regulated. And it's going to end up a tool of the state, not just to enforce the law, which would be fine, but to actually create prior restraint on financial transactions, to either sub silentio, which is how it usually happens, pressure a bank to say, we're not going to pass a law that says you can't donate to WikiLeaks, but if you're a patriot, American Express, you'll stop processing these credit card transactions. And that's more like the person following you around and binding your hands so you can't hand the money to the person you're paying. That kind of control before due process, because no one's accusing you of a crime, you're just no longer allowed to pay this person, is not something I like about our current technological and financial ecosystem. And crypto fixes that. And that's going to cause a lot of issues.
But it seems like it's a worthy conversation to have, right? About that Americans should have about what it means to have that privacy or not.
I think so. I mean, I obviously agree. I work at Coin Center. We published a report 4 years ago called the Case for Electric Cash, where Jerry, our executive director, lays out the sort of moral and ethical argument that we should be able to engage in peer-to-peer transactions online without prior restraint, without censorship, because otherwise we don't have an open society. And the alternative, which is sort of like a central bank digital currency or a world like China today, where almost all payments are through Alipay or WeChat, and everything is intermediated and surveilled and controlled is not a free and open world. And it's a dangerous one because of the centralization of power in the hands of a political elite that will probably abuse that power. So obviously I agree. And then I wrote a companion report the next year arguing for how you can interpret certain aspects of our Constitution as guaranteeing those rights, which some of those arguments hopefully will get tested in court in the next few years to the extent they need to be tested in court. But
We have like
you've got me. You've got me wildly agreeing with you. Yeah.
awesome. We have like a 2-minute hard stop, but Rebecca, do you have closing words for us?
No, I really said a lot of what I wanted to say, which was like, just get involved, take a seat at the table. Let's try to come to some reasonable, at least public facing position. And, you know, try to hammer out the rest behind the scenes, at least as lawyers and policy people. There are a lot of good people in crypto working together in policy and working really, really collaboratively, both on the Hill, Cobie, and in other places. And I think everybody should be doing that, and people should definitely try to join in as much as they can. And the other thing I think that really gets missed is there are people in VC and elsewhere who do want to do the right thing long term for the technology, whether it's in centralized crypto or in DeFi. And we got to make sure we are giving those people credit and working collaboratively with them too.
Rebecca, thank you so much. Peter, thank you so much.
Guys.
Y'all can follow their work on the internet. Aave, Coin Center. I don't know what else I'm supposed to say. Is there something else there? Was that
great.
it?
Thanks, guys.
Thanks
Thank
for
you
joining
both for
us.
joining us.
Thanks.
Appreciate all y'all being here with us. I just pulled an all y'all, so you know, shout out to me for that one. Yeah, good talking to you, Cobie. We'll see you next time.
Ciao.
Thanks.